Hey everybody, this is graphic designer Roberto Blake of robertoblake.com helping you create something awesome today. So, in today's video, we're going to address one of my favorite subjects. We're going to address the Mac versus PC thing yet again, and this time I'm going to go deep into the reasons why some graphic designers use Mac instead of PC. Now, here's the upfront disclaimer on this. Number one, I use Mac and PC, and I don't have a preference one way or the other. I think that they're both great at doing my work, and that there are experiences and things about each of them where it's a little easier one versus the other to do some things, but that actually has more to do with who made what software for what platform than the actual platform itself. And another thing, I want to go ahead and I'm going to call the gearheads out before they get to the comment section. 95% of people are not interested in the whole Unix coding aspect of the Mac versus PC argument and the operating system from that point of view, and things that have to do with the way that handles RAM and processing power and so on and so forth. And I get that, but it's incremental micro arguments in terms of how it affects the actual usage and the experience that 95% of people actually care about. So putting that stuff in the comments section, while it's interesting and shows us how smart you are, is not very helpful one way or the other in helping people get over their biases. So I'm going to stick to some more relevant information in this video rather than going down the gearhead technical route and showing everyone how smart I am. Anyway, let's move on. The primary reason that most graphic designers use Mac instead of PC is marketing optics. The bottom line is that Mac has an industry association with our profession the same way that Adobe does for reasons, and I will get to those reasons. But if someone sees you as a client, if you walk into a coffee shop and you have a Mac, they're instantly more impressed and more interested in you as a graphic designer than if you have a PC. And in the job market, there are art directors and creative directors who, if you don't have Mac experience or you walk in with a PC, that's a deal breaker as to whether you get hired. And that's not fair, and I don't believe in that bias. It's not one that I practice or will ever practice, but I will explain why it happens right now. Why do graphic designers, especially of an older generation, preference Macs over PC? Well, for the answer to that, we have to go back to the 1980s. 25 years ago, when John and Thomas Knoll, the Knoll brothers, who created Adobe Photoshop, were first pitching the idea, they were pitching it to two companies. They were pitching it to Adobe, and they were pitching it to Apple. So Photoshop was almost an Apple product, believe it or not. So that's interesting. Photoshop was also created on the first color display Macintosh computer. So Photoshop, which is our gold star industry standard and one of the most powerful applications we have as graphic designers, the application that ultimately defines our industry and that everyone who's not a graphic designer judges us by, is Photoshop. It has a long history with Apple and the Mac, and that is a big part of this. So Photoshop was built and designed on a Macintosh computer, and when it came out in, I think, 1990, it was initially a Mac exclusive release for Photoshop 1.0. So that is a big part of it, and that means that all the digital graphic designers that were just starting out and getting into the digital age and starting to do their work that way, that were doing digital typography in its infancy, all of the great minds of graphic design, their first experience of Photoshop, their first experience of digital graphic design was done on an Apple computer 25 years ago. So anyone with 2 decades in of experience that is an art director, a creative director, they remember that, and that was their experience or was the experience of their boss. And then as a good apprentice, they adopted the preferences and the ideals of the person above them who groomed them. And so, well, Apple was what I learned on, Apple was what my boss used, that's what I'm going to use, that's what my apprentices are going to use, that's what the people that I train are going to use, and it just becomes this indoctrination. So you have 2+ decades, 2.5 decades of designers starting out on Macintosh and nothing else, and having a superior experience of Photoshop in that arena during the early, hardware wars in terms of personal computers. The divide between Windows users and Apple users, if you think it's bad today, back then it was a whole different thing. And that's part of the whole think different, philosophy, and the fact that creative professionals across the gamut, whether they were musicians, artists, photographers, graphic designers, whatever, were using Apple products and Macintosh computers, and everyone else in the corporate business world, everything that was, all establishment and practical, they were using IBM and Windows and all of that stuff. So that's where the divide or the schism really comes from. And it took a long time for people to even consider, going in a different direction. So we still are feeling the ripple effects of that because, again, the majority of the people in our industry that are in hiring positions that are in creative services have only ever used Windows when they were forced to, and they preference using Mac, and it's really, all they might know or what their best experience or their longest experience has been, so they're going to preference it. That doesn't mean that Mac is superior by any stretch of the imagination for what we do as creative professionals using the Adobe and the Corel products. Quite to the contrary, there are a lot of programs that are helpful to graphic designers, video producers, photographers that don't exist on the Apple and Mac platform, and Apple has also discontinued some of its products or has not added features to keep them robust. We're losing, as photographers, we're losing Aperture. It's being retired, and they're doing this Photos thing. That's some hybrid between that and iPhoto, and you lose all the really great pro features. So now people are moving over to Lightroom, and if you're going to use Lightroom, then you could use that on Windows as well as Mac, and now with the mobile stuff, you can use it on Android for Lightroom Mobile, and obviously on the iOS if you have an iPhone or iPad. So again, you can be platform agnostic as a photographer now because there's no real advantage as a photographer to using Apple now that Aperture is out of the picture per se. If you're a video professional, Adobe Premiere Pro has been stepping up the game, and I think that it still blows Final Cut Pro away and always has, the difference being the price point. So there's that. And obviously, if you're a graphic designer and you live in Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, Acrobat, then you already know that if that's where you live, the difference in the user experience between a Mac and a PC, Windows side, you're not really seeing it anyway because you're living in the Adobe platforms. And as long as the specs are the same on the machines, the experience for you performance-wise is going to be about the same, or at least within 95% of the same. And, that's what it is. And for that reason, you should be able, as a graphic designer that wants to work in the world today, you should be able to use Windows and you should be able to use Mac, because the reality is you need to be able to use whatever tools are available to you from the client or from the job or from wherever you are in the world. If you don't have your setup, you still need to be able to do your work. So these are the reasons that, some designers use or preference Apple Macintosh versus Windows PC. And it comes from the top down in terms of who they worked with and who hired them and who trained them. And now they're, grafting that philosophy onto the people that come after them, or even making it a job requirement. And that's where it comes from. And the result is that young graphic designers today don't think that they can be competitive in the field or even get into the industry if they don't learn Mac. And I think that that's just wrong. And as long as you have the skills and you know the base programs or their equivalents that you're supposed to know, that you should feel confident to compete in this arena, whether you can afford this piece of machinery or not. Anyway, that is why I believe, and I've given you some evidence to back that up, many graphic designers preference Mac instead of Windows. But I'd like to hear your opinions in the comment section below, and let me know your thoughts on the Mac versus PC argument. Do you agree with me that it is irrelevant to have that argument today, and that's really a matter of preference and a matter of what your experience has been and what you're comfortable with, just like the Nikon versus Canon debate? Or do you think that there are legitimate reasons to use one versus the other as it pertains to graphic design or the creative industry? Anyway, like this video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. Check out the other awesome content on the channel. As always, you guys, thanks so much for watching. And don't forget, create something awesome today.